Hey guys, it's Katie from Without a Crystal Ball. Welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad to have you here. It's Monday, October 18th. We haven't talked about the Gabby Petito case in a few days, but there really hasn't been a lot to say. I've been trying to stay out of the sort of sensational aspect of things, but I noticed this going around on social media, and this is really the first time that a friend of the Laundries has spoken out. And what they're saying about Gabby Petito and the relationship that existed between Roberta and Gabby seems to suggest that the silence by the Laundrie family could be because, well, they didn't have the best feelings for Gabby. A friend of the family, or a friend of Roberta, started speaking out, and she actually posted on September 28th. Now I want to let you guys know that the posts were made by this friend of Roberta before the coroner came out with the full results of what happened to Gabby. At the point that these comments were made, there was no information about how things happened. We knew very little beyond that they needed to do further testing. This was after Brian's indictment had happened for the fraud, though, and so it's interesting because this individual had some things to say about Gabby and what she felt was going on behind the scenes, and it was not complimentary to Gabby, which really begs the question, what was Roberta telling friends, and what was Brian telling his family about Gabby? And is this the reason why there is such a big disconnect or unrest or unhappiness between the families? So the woman came out, and she is a former coworker. So according to this woman, who actually went ahead and updated her post, her original post said this: "It's hard to, because I know Brian and he's really nice and his mother is an absolute gem. I worked with Roberta and she crocheted me a poncho. She's given me so much advice throughout my time working with her, and we've remained close friends since then. And it breaks my heart to see two families going through such horrible things. The entire world is gawking and throwing their 2 cents in and making fun of them like we're in elementary school and nobody taught each other how to be kind to one another. I think the hardest thing is that all people are acting like they know what happened before any information got out and are talking horrible things about Brian and his family." There was another murder not far away from around the same time, but there was no big press on it. What I do believe is that Gabby has a laundry list of mental health issues, financial irresponsibilities, and other issues, and Brian and his family have been so supportive through the years. She lived in their home rent-free, both with the sister and Brian, and with the parents at different times. I spoke with Roberta at length about some of the situations that had occurred in the house, and they were all living together. Did not sound easy. I think she meant it did not sound easy. The fact that people are saying that Brian stole her van and used her card, when I know he poured in so much of his savings for her to live out her dreams and to try and make her happy, is heartbreaking. He's being treated like the scum of the earth, and now his parents are being treated like the parents of the scum of the earth because they are trying to do the right thing and protect him. And anyone who thinks they wouldn't do whatever they could for their child doesn't deserve to have children. The truth may never come out, the whole truth, and even if Gabby was murdered by someone else, it turns out if it was an accident or self-inflicted, Brian and his family will forever be hated, and even if he's completely proven without a doubt not to be the one responsible for her death. Half the world thinks they know what happened, and based on a few articles, that's scary." This obviously didn't land very well, because we already know what happened to Gabby. We don't know who. They haven't said who. The only thing that they have said is that Brian is the only person of interest. Brian is the only person that had the means, the manners, the motive, whatever that is. And he was the last person seen with Gabby. So it's really unlikely that it's anybody else at this point. Plus, he took her cards. He took her card. He took her van, credit cards, and drove home. She is seeming to suggest that the money in that account belonged to both Brian and to Gabby, and also that Brian is the one that was so patient with Gabby and Gabby was the one that had all these issues. And it was Brian that had to put up with all of these issues. And it was Roberta that had to deal with all of these problems with Gabby. Obviously, she got a lot of criticism, a ton. And then there was a comment by her mother who further expanded on what Roberta really thought about Gabby. And it's kind of sad. So this is what her mother said. My daughter has been friends with Roberta and the Laundrie family since she and Roberta worked together for Suffolk County. They remained friends after the Laundries moved down to Florida. Years ago, Roberta adored my daughter so much that she wanted my daughter and Brian to get together. My daughter felt she was just too young. He was just too young for her. He was around 19 and she was turning 30. Life went on, and eventually Roberta began expressing to my daughter that there was just too many problems with Gabby. Not having gainful employment, sleeping all day, drinking, smoking herb, not being grateful for meals, not helping around the house. My daughter tried being supportive to Roberta, working on having patience and understanding with Gabby. Roberta seemed relieved for a little break when they began their van life adventure this past June. Clearly, something went sourly wrong along the way. If anything, I've learned not to jump onto any bandwagons until the truth is revealed. We truly do not know anything yet. Roberta has not corresponded back to any of my daughter's texts or messages. So according to Mom, Roberta really liked this girl, and Roberta wanted Brittany and Brian to be girlfriend and boyfriend, but they were like 11 years apart, which seems sort of weird. And their position is that Roberta did not like Gabby, thought she was lazy, wasn't keen on the way that Gabby acted, and it was not Brian that had any problems. When you think about the silence here and the fact that Roberta is not contacting back the family, the Petitos, not responding to questions, not answering questions, not talking to anyone, could a complicated relationship between the Laundries and Gabby have been a reason for that? Was there some bad blood between them, and that's why they might have been, I don't know, glad that he broke up with her? Another one of his friends actually put together this on his Instagram. Now, this is one of his friends from high school, and he seemed to suggest that Brian and Gabby had broken up and he needed a lawyer because it looked bad. So one of his high school friends said this. When someone asked him why Brian lawyered up, why Brian wasn't talking, this is what he said. If you broke up with your fiance and you went your separate ways and then found out she was missing by having cops come to your door, what would you do? Getting a lawyer is a good option, especially after how everything looked. According to some of the friends, the hypothesis is that Brian came home and they had broken up, and perhaps Brian was telling people that they had broken up, and he only told people after the fact that he found out about what happened to Gabby after he got home, when the cops showed up at his house and told him that Gabby was missing, which literally makes no sense, but it's the story that maybe Brian is sticking to according to his friends. Now, some of the questions that I think are, why now? Now, in terms of what happened in Moab, Utah on August 12th, the friend of Roberta even had an excuse for that. Check this out. She said this: the body cam footage is clear that he was also overtly apologetic as well, and not saying anything against Gabby, and if anything was covering for her and trying not to add any details that would make her look bad. The police were trying to press charges against Gabby for assaulting him and domestic violence, as he's covered in scratches caused by her, and he did his best to downplay it so she wouldn't get in any trouble. The officers didn't notice any injuries, bruises, or scratches on Gabby that I'm aware of, and if they did, they certainly didn't mention it in the police recordings, which is not true. They did mention it. And he says this is different from what she said about Brian, as trying to pass the blame on him for asking her to calm down before getting in the vehicle, which is a responsible thing to do if you're about to be in the vehicle with someone driving and the road putting yourself and other people's lives in danger. But obviously she didn't calm down enough, and because of that, she was grabbing the wheel, causing him to drive out of the lane, which is apparently how they got pulled over. Which, again, this woman seems to not have she's going off memory, and it seems like she doesn't really fully remember what happened, because that's not actually what happened according to the eyewitnesses. But another thing that they talked about was that the relationship itself. So she said, the reason I didn't mention any of Brian's mental health issues is simply because I've never noticed any of his or been told of any of his. So there was nothing I could say about him in that regard. That absolutely does not mean I'm victim blaming. She said Gabby had mental health issues before her relationship with Brian, before she died, before the cops pulled them over, before they went out to their trip, and before they moved in together years ago with the other family members. As narcissistic tendency are more or less innate, her compulsions and control issue disorders are likely rooted in childhood and adolescence. And yes, that can be intensified throughout your life if not identified and addressed. In regards to the van, I assume that they were both leasing it, just like the car she was leasing that she couldn't afford and gave back to her mom to deal with a few years ago. So it's clear that from this woman's perspective, Roberta has a lot to say about Gabby, at least in the eyes of, Gabby is the one that has the mental health problems. Gabby's the one that's not working. Gabby's the one that has issues with, her compulsions and all of these other things. But here's the thing, that story about Gabby doesn't match what anyone else has said about her. In terms of what her family has said about Gabby, in terms of what Gabby's friends have said about Gabby, none of that matches or aligns to who Gabby was. Did she have anxiety? Clearly she did on the day of the stop in Moab, Utah, but her parents say that she was never diagnosed with anything. And in regards to the relationship between her and Brian, her friends described Brian as the one that was sort of controlling and Gabby the one that was always bending to what Brian wanted, and Brian being the one that dictated who Gabby was friends with. Many also said that this idea of going on the van trip was the two of them, not just Gabby. So when you have two separate stories and you have two separate situations like this, it's clear, at least in the way that this woman is describing it, that there was some bad blood between Gabby and the Laundries. They either just did not like the relationship between Gabby and Brian. Gabby's behavior somehow bothered them. I don't know. But Roberta's idea about who Gabby was doesn't seem to match anybody else's idea of who Gabby was, which begs the question was the way that Brian treated Gabby causing her to act uncharacteristic to who she actually was, which can happen in DV situations, especially when you're being gaslit and controlled, and you have someone that's constantly demanding that you do things and isolating you from other people. It can cause severe issues with your mental health. I would take a grain of salt here. I don't know why this woman would refuse to see the evidence that's been clearly stated that this car was not leased. It was owned by Gabby. The title is in Gabby's name. They obviously owned it because they completely ripped it apart. And in terms of the bank accounts, if Brian had his own money, then he should have had his own credit card. If Brian had poured money into his life, then he would have bank accounts, but he didn't have bank accounts. And Gabby's friends said that Brian hadn't been working up until the point of them going on this trip, that it was Gabby that was working 50 to 60 hours a week, that it was Gabby that was saving the money for this trip, and that Brian was laid off from Publix and hadn't got another job due to COVID. So these two worlds don't match, and I'm more inclined, based on the amount of people that have spoken out about Gabby, to believe them than anything that the Laundries are telling anyone about Gabby. That's not to say she didn't have anxiety, but that doesn't explain nor excuse what Brian has allegedly done to her. He is still only considered a person of interest, and he's still a wanted fugitive. So the flying monkeys are out. Roberta has people poisoned, believing Gabby's the one that's at fault. And this is where we're at today, which also explains that perhaps Brian wasn't honest with his parents about what happens and has gaslit his parents to believe that it's all Gabby's fault and not his, which at this point I wouldn't be shocked if what he told them. We don't know their involvement. We don't know what they've done. We don't know if they've tried to hide him. We don't know anything. But what we do know is that there's a girl whose life was lost, that domestic violence is the likely reason for why this happened, that she could have gotten out, that she did not deserve this, and she is clearly not the one to blame in a situation where he's the one that came home alive and she wasn't. people like Brian and people that are in situations like Gabby and Brian where the abuser, they have a really good job, they do a really good job of making the victim look like they're the crazy one, when the fact is it's the abuser's behavior that is making the victim appear crazy. All right, you guys, tell me what your thoughts are in the comments below. Bye.